Good evening, everyone, and welcome back for our weekly consultation here on The Doctor Will See You Now. And this week, it's a little bit special because we've had a chance to dress up, and the Doctor does enjoy a chance to dress up. The reason being is our guest author this week is none other than my fellow Newcastle dweller, Fiona Veitch Smith. Anybody who's familiar, welcome, by the way, Fiona. It's lovely to have you with us here in the consultation room. How are you doing?
It's lovely to be here, Dr. Noir.
Are you well?
I've been really well. As you say, what a great chance to get dressed up in this lockdown era when we never have a chance to get dressed up.
Indeed, indeed. So just so that you know, Fiona's series, the Poppy Denby series, is set in that glorious golden age of the 1920s. And so we thought we would dress accordingly. And Fiona's even sipping on some champagne as we speak, although she promises me it's non-alcoholic. But I think we can just dream, because I do think a lot of lockdown life is all to do about dreaming. And just a thought as well, because as we're slowly in our various parts of the UK and around the world trying to come out of lockdown, do stay safe and do make it to those bookstores and bookshops, if nothing else. Anyway, back to the consultation. So, Fiona, you're a former journalist and you spent time in Cape Town in South Africa, I do believe. And you, whilst you are now locked in your writing, but you're also lecturing in journalism and you're also giving workshops in creative writing. And I'd like to ask you about that as well, if there's time, while we're together. But first and foremost, I would love to know how you got into writing crime fiction and why you set your series in the 1920s, and then who is Poppy Denby? So it's almost like a three-pronged attack there with you. Just feel free and tell me all.
Well, why crime fiction? Why the 1920s? Why Poppy Denby? Well, crime fiction, I've always loved, I suppose like most crime writers, started out reading Secret Seven, Famous Five, all the mysteries. And I also loved Nancy Drew. She was my absolute favorite when I was young, and I thought she was extremely glamorous. And one day I wanted to be like Nancy Drew. And then I became a journalist. As you say, it was in Cape Town. I am from Britain, but my dad emigrated there and took the family there in 1980, got a job on the mines there. I went to high school there and then university, and then moved to Cape Town, where I joined the Cape Times community newspapers there. And when I was there, I worked on the arts and entertainment beat, just like Poppy Denby. And I also covered crime. It was a small budget, so I had to do both. And as such, I ended up having the contrast between 1 week literally investigating murders, well, not me investigating as a detective, but as a journalist covering murders in Cape Town, and then the following week doing something on the latest Amdram production at the local Mask Theatre. So it was the contrast between those two things that has really always been part of my life, and the link between the darkness and the light and jumping from one to the other is I really enjoyed that tension. And that was really the roots of Poppy Denby. Why the 1920s? Well, I actually started out, I wrote a historical novel set in the first century, a historical romance, something completely different. And I thought that I had a publishing contract for it. I had a publisher who was interested, but at the final hurdle, the editorial team decided against it. They had some other material in that area and didn't want to go down that route. And the publisher said to me, do you have anything else? well, I didn't actually have anything else in the drawer.
Mhm.
But that very day that I was rejected, I'd just been up to Morpeth to visit Emily Wilding Davison's grave. And Emily Wilding Davison, if you recall, is the famous suffragette who attempted to throw the colours of the women's suffrage movement onto the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913. She was run down and she died, sadly, 5 days later. And some years later, the jockey actually committed suicide, which is a very tragic aside. So I'd been to visit her grave on the centenary of her death. And when I was there, I was thinking to myself, wouldn't it be great to do a detective series about suffragettes, as you do? And I was just thinking, well, Emily, what if Emily was murdered or was part of a bigger conspiracy about other suffragettes who'd been murdered? And so my mind started ticking over. And it was just an idea. And when I got home, I received this email from the publisher rejecting this first century novel. And he said, is there anything else? And lo and behold, I just had this whole idea already from just being at Emily's grave. And I said, well, how would you feel about a detective series about suffragettes? He said, sounds absolutely brilliant, because we were coming up to the centenary of all of that. So I started writing it, and she was initially called Daisy Denby. And then I'll tell you about the name change in a minute. So Daisy Denby, I started writing and got about 3 months into the process, and I was just bored stiff. There was so, apart from the suffragettes themselves were quite exciting, but I wasn't really into the period. It hadn't come alive for me, and I didn't really know why. And around about the same time, I was doing, I'd started as a midlife crisis, starting to learn jazz clarinet. It was either that or skydiving. So jazz clarinet was the safer option. So I'd started it, really useless. I wasn't very good at all. But I'd started it, and I was working towards my jazz clarinet exams. Very stressful when you're in your 40s doing exams. But the music of that period, I was doing lots of 1920s music in preparation for this exam. And I thought, you know what? I've always loved the 20s. I've always loved the fashion of the 20s, the music of the 20s, the history of the 20s as well. Always loved it. And I thought, why don't I move Daisy Denby into the 1920s and just try it? And so instead of her being a suffragette detective, I made her the niece of a suffragette who was investigating a cold case death of a former suffragette. And I started writing it, and it took me a day, and I was into it. And finally, I'd found my voice. I'd found the period. I found something that brought me and the character alive. But readers of 1920s fiction will already know that there is a very famous lady detective known as Daisy Dalrymple. And I thought we couldn't have Daisy Denby and Daisy Dalrymple. It would just be the double D's. It would just be too much in 2 daisies. So that's why I changed the name, and I got suggestions from friends, and someone said, well, what about reminiscent of the First World War that underpins particularly the first book, the memories of the war and the tragedy of the war and people who were lost in the war. It's very much part of that first book, and they suggested we call her Poppy. And I thought that was great. Poppy Denby, that works, and that's how Poppy Denby was born. And we're now
Beautiful.
5 books into it.
Which is just, I think that is glorious to think that, again, what I love about these consultation times with writers is finding a little bit more out about how characters come into being, or about finding out how maybe, because when we first meet an author, often they're very established, they have their series, but sometimes we don't know about how it maybe didn't set off the way that we think it might have set off, or maybe an author had to change or make those modifications. So really appreciate you sharing that with us, because I can imagine that for many people who are familiar with your work, Poppy is just a character that's very much cemented, in their reading and in how they see her. So thanks for saying that she didn't set off like that. Now, the other thing that I find interesting about the series, of course, is that Poppy, as that young woman, she travels a lot. Fiona, in your work. Yeah, she
That was
has
far more than
many.
I do.
She has many an adventure. And what I wanted to ask you was, as you know, as you've gone through this series, have you known the places that she was going to go to before you began each of the novels? Or as you were working through it, did that other space that you take her to, did that come as you were developing?
I think the only place that was a mix of both.
Mm-hmm.
The first one obviously is set in London, because the whole the tension of it is that small town girl going to the big city, and London was the place of in the early 1920s was the place of the jazz clubs and the fashion and the flatbeds and all the excitement. So in order to create the ambiance of it, it really had to be in London. I knew that at some stage, because she'd come from the north, she would have to eventually journey back, just as part of her personal development and her narrative journey. And from the very early books, we established that there's some tension with her family, and that ultimately needs to be resolved. In order for it to be resolved, she needs to come home. So eventually she would have to get back to the northeast. When that happened, I wasn't really sure. The second book has a big Russian connection. Now, that wasn't planned. It didn't come about through Poppy's story, really. How it came about was I was reading a book, a non-fiction book, about the Romanovs. And how they had to escape Russia, and how some of the family obviously was murdered when they were there. But some of the Romanovs, the extras, the cousins and the Romanov lights, as it were, managed to escape, and they came to both Paris and London, and then moved on, a lot of them, to America. And I was reading a non-fiction book about that. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some kind of intersection between the world of Poppy Denby and the glamorous but tragic world of the Romanovs? So that came from a book that I was reading. The New York connection is interesting. Book 3 is New York. And I think New York was going to be inevitable as well, because her editor, Rollo Rollinson, who's, apart from Poppy, seems to be everyone else's favorite character. And he's a New Yorker. And he comes to London. Well, he actually comes over to Europe as a war correspondent initially. And then when he's in London, he wins the Daily Globe, Poppy's newspaper, in a poker game. You probably remember that. And then he settles in London, because Prohibition has just taken off in New York, and he couldn't possibly live there with Prohibition, because he does like his whiskey, does our Rollo. So he ends up settling in London simply because he can't bear not having a drink back home. And so again, I thought, well, he's got the New York connection, but my family has a bit of a New York connection as well. In that, not in the 20s, but in the 30s, my grandma, Betty, used to travel across to New York. Well, I say fairly often. She went 2 or 3 times, because she had a cousin in New York, and she used to go on the cruise liners. And she always used to tell me about this wonderful, glamorous time being on the cruise liners. And then my dad, in the 1960s, worked on the cruise liners on a ship called the Ocean Monarch. And that used to travel from Southampton to New York to Bermuda. It used to do a circuit. And of course, I used to grow up terrified of the Bermuda Triangle because of that. Bizarrely, that didn't come into the Poppy books. But again, that connection to my dad and the stories he used to tell me about traveling to New York, and my grandma in the 30s traveling to New York on the cruise liners, plus Rollo being from New York, sort of made it inevitable there would be a New York connection. And then there's Egypt, Cairo in book 4. Now, it never actually, I was going to have Poppy going to Cairo, which would have been the most exciting thing possible. But I wanted to go myself, because I wanted to write about it. And I wasn't at the time, been quite a lot of violence, and there've been some massacres. If you, at Sharm el Sheikh, I think it was, if you recall.
Yeah.
And there were travel warnings about not going to Egypt. And so I was decided the family would have been appalled if I'd gone. And I decided not to go because of that. But because of that, I changed it that Poppy herself didn't go to Egypt. And there was a backstory murder that took place in Egypt. And then book 5, where are we? We're up to Newcastle. There you go. Book 5, I finally got to Newcastle.
Yes.
And that's because of the family. And that's where we are now.
Which is wonderful.
We're
I mean,
we're in Newcastle.
It's wonderful. I mean, thank you for taking us through Poppy's journey and the notion that with the book 5, she comes home. Now, for all those people who were already Poppy fans, and hopefully we're garnering some new Poppy fans as well, as we're discussing here, when can we get our mitts on The Art Fiasco? When is it out, Fiona?
The 23rd of October. It's coming out simultaneously in the UK and North America simultaneously, ebook and print. It's also, audiobook's been recorded, but I don't have a release date for the audiobook yet, but it should be the autumn as well.
Wonderful. A treat for October. And can I say, I was just having a look on Amazon before, and again, anybody who gets their books that way, I do believe there's some fabulous pricing on previous books, again, to whet your appetite. So it's a very good price in there just to get in if you're not into the series yet. So Poppy comes home.
Can I just say that perhaps people might want to start with the Jazz Files, which is the first one, and they've still got time to catch up before October, because although each story is self-contained, the mystery is self-contained in each one, Poppy's story does develop through it. And there's some personal developments that, while you'll still understand and enjoy the mystery, you might not get your full enjoyment out of Poppy's personal story, unless perhaps you followed it from earlier on. So there's still time to get hold of the books.
Yeah, honestly, and I'm so with Fiona on this. Honestly, it is such a beautiful way to escape. There's adventure, there's mystery, there's there's murder solved. It's a wonderful ride. I think that both you and Poppy take the reader on. Great escape, and I really, thank you, Fiona, for creating that. But to book 5, you bring her home.
Yes.
And I just wonder, can you say to us, because of course we never want to give too much away, but can you say to us whether the coming home is for a happy reason, or is it for a sad reason?
It's for Poppy. It's for a happy reason to start with. It's her father's 60th birthday. Her father is a Methodist minister who lives in Morpeth, and she comes up for his birthday party. And en route, she stops off at Newcastle. For people who don't know the area, Newcastle's about 25 minutes south of Morpeth. So she pops into Newcastle to visit her Aunt Dot and her companion Grace, who've inherited a house which they're renovating, and they're going to be renting it out. So she's initially just going to stop over and see her aunt and her aunt's companion for a few days before going up for the birthday party. But of course, when she's here, there happens to be a murder, as happens quite often in Poppy's little life, and she's forced to stay in Newcastle and to investigate it. But it turns out that actually is a family connection. Her family is somehow connected to this murder as well. So she does see her family, but perhaps not for the right reasons, but as you say, it's very sad reasons.
And then the art connection, and of course anybody who's visited Newcastle will know of, and who's into art will know of, the beautiful Lang Art Gallery by the City Library, and it plays a role, does it not, in the book? And what I'd like to ask you, Fiona, about this is, because of course your book was created long before lockdown, did you spend quite a bit of time in the Lang, and how was that experience while you were there?
Oh, I did. And again, there's a connection with my grandmother as well, with the Lane Art Gallery. Very quick aside, but it's quite important for the roots of the book, is that my great-grandfather was murdered here in the Northeast. He was a miner, and he lived in Clara Vale, which is in County Durham. It's a short drive from Newcastle. And he was attacked in a pub and killed. And it was the man was arrested for murder and was later commuted to manslaughter. And since that time, I always wanted to write a murder mystery set around a mining village. And the mining village, I will get back to the Lane Art Gallery, I absolutely promise, because there is a connection here. I've got to go via my great-grandfather's murder to find out how I got to the Lane Art Gallery. So, great-grandfather Matthew Gill was murdered, and it was a family story. That's now they got a payout. His family, there was his wife and 5 was left without from them, and this then was winners. And my great grandmother was quite keen that her daughters, climbing is an unpleasant way of putting it, but would perhaps raise themselves a little bit. And so she used to send them off to places like the Lane Art Gallery to get a little bit of culture. And again, my grandmother used to tell me about going to the Lane Art Gallery in the 20s. And she used to tell me about various events that used to take place there. So again, I thought the Lane Art Gallery is a perfect connection, because the murder that takes place is of an artist, a world famous artist, who had grown up in a mining village, and she had been the daughter of a miner. So again, there's a bit of a family parallel there. And I went along to the gallery, and the gallery was founded in, now I'm going to get it wrong. It's either 1902 or 1904. Please shoot me if I've got it wrong. It's one of those. And so it wasn't actually in the 1920s. It wasn't founded in the 1920s, but it was certainly well established in the 1920s. And I went along to the gallery. It hasn't changed much in that time. Absolutely beautiful gallery. And I spent lots of time literally wandering around, wondering exactly where the murder would take place. And initially, I thought it would take place in one part of the gallery. I won't tell you where it was. But then I met the caretaker. And the caretaker of the gallery, I was asking him some questions about different parts of the gallery that were perhaps closed off now and we couldn't get to. And I was just trying to figure out how this murder might have taken place and how the murderer might have escaped. And I was restricted to where I could go just as a visitor at the gallery. And he very, very kindly offered to take me on a tour of the backstage of the gallery, which was just amazing. And he took me down into the basement and into all the blocked off areas, the area that used to be the stables but is no more, another area that would go out to the tower. You could go out to the tower along up a staircase and across the roof. I didn't go across the roof, health and safety. Yeah. But he took me to the door of that so I could see where it all took place. And there is nothing to replace that. So the place in the gallery that the murder was going to take place was changed because this very kind man showed me behind the scenes. And I could just, writing it, I was there the whole time. I was able to take photographs of everything, but I'd seen the place and I could imagine the place. And some of the artwork that is in the book was actually there in the 1920s. And I try to use the original paintings as much as I can, just to get an idea of what it was really like. Not that we can ever know what it's really like. I try to recreate it the best I can.
I must say, Fiona, even just listening to you, and I think that devotion to research, and again, I think you know, the example that you give is you know, if people are even just setting out on writing their book, to not be shy, to ask, you know, to push those doors and say, you know, can you show me something, or you know, can you tell me more about this? Because, you know, that idea then of being able to, for whatever we're developing, to be more authentic, and, you know, to have, especially I think on, you know, those historical elements that open up, you know, that time for us even more. I have another question.
Right, sorry. One thing on that is that
Please.
new writers, to encourage them, particularly with historicals, you find that the people who are desperate to share their knowledge, researchers, academics, curators, caretakers of galleries, these people absolutely love their work with a passion, and they are just desperate. You think, how am I going to find out this information? They're just desperate to share their love, and they're just so relieved that someone's actually interested in what they've devoted their entire lives to. And just very briefly, the one that went across to New York, I needed to find out how many toilets were on this ship. I need to figure out how Poppy got to the loo, and I was someone put me in touch with a man who's an expert in the cruise liners of that period, and I got in touch with him, and all I really needed to know is how many loos there were and where the loo was in relation to Poppy's cabin, just so the poor lass didn't have to keep crossing her legs the whole time. And he spent days with me, sending me all this information, and I wished I could use it all, but I ended up just using a single paragraph about the loo because that's all I really needed. But he was just so generous with his time and his knowledge. And you'll find that if you are writing historical fiction, you're never going to be short of people who have got a story to share, and you can draw on their experiences. And sorry I interrupted you, Jackie. Please carry on.
No, please, honestly, because it's wonderful to hear your tales. I love it. But I wanted to ask the importance for you of how to say this. The preeminence that there seems to be in your work of being able to give female voices a preeminence, and the characters that you bring us. You know, I'm thinking of Dot, and I'm thinking of the painter. I mean, that at a time when maybe women's voices weren't heard as much, but in your work, those voices are clearly heard. Was that something that was important for you?
It was, but it wasn't. It was conscious and unconscious. It was as if I couldn't have written it any other way. The voices of women just had to come through, and I wasn't being woke, or to use a pertinent expression these days. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm deliberately going to do something that's all feminist and everything, because I'm not a radical feminist. I am a feminist, but I certainly couldn't say I'm a rad feminist or anything like that. But the stories of women and women's progression, and particularly in the workplace, is something that I am very passionate about and always have been. And so I think the stories just came through instinctively. I didn't think to myself, I must have a majority cast of women. But looking back, that's exactly what I've done. It's and the good men in it are the men like Rollo who enable women and give them what's the word I'm looking for? Agency. They are men who give women agency, and these are the positive characters in it. And of course, we've got other negative characters, both male and female, who try to prevent women from having agency. And so, yes, it is essentially important, intrinsically important to my work, but it wasn't consciously so, but it is. Does that make any sense?
Yes, yes, yeah, I think it does. And I think, again, you know, how in that creative process, you know, that you say that things just happen unconsciously because they're there, and they want to out. So I'm always conscious of time, but I'm going to squeeze as much out of our time together as possible. Here we are with Poppy now then in book 5, and Poppy's come home, and as ever, murder and mayhem seem to follow her. And I wonder, in the space of these 5 books, and again, without giving everything away, how do you feel she has developed as a woman, as a person, from when she first began with that opportunity to go to London and be a, you know, that fledgling journalist, and 5 books later, where is she? What kind of person has she become?
She's definitely grown. She starts out in the Jazz Files as very naive, very nervous. She's not sure about, she's going into a different class. She comes from quite a modest background, and she goes into high society, and she feels very uncomfortable there. She's very uncomfortable with fashion. She has her best friend is a flapper and a jazz singer who jazzes her up, but she in herself, Poppy, literally arrives dressed in a fawn outfit, and by the end of it she's in flame red. So it's the and getting her clothes off the Paris runway. But she is in herself. She's quite nervous, but she has a strength within her. And even though she sometimes just collapses in a heap and cries, she gets up and she carries on. And that the inner strength is something in her that's never changed. That's something that is intrinsic to Poppy, who she is. But her sense of that strength, and a sense as a woman, and a professional woman, a woman who can say now yes or no to a romantic relationship. Whereas at the beginning, she was just all flustered that anyone was interested in her in the first place. But now by book 5, she's able to say yes or no. She's able to say, actually, I'm not interested in that, and you've gone too far, sir. Whereas at the beginning, she was quite, she was a romantic at the beginning. And professionally as well. Professionally, she's now, at the beginning, she would be absolutely appalled. The slightest lie, the slightest twist of the truth, the slightest ulterior motive, or perhaps taking a circuitous way around something to get to the ultimate truth. She was very straight-laced in that. Now she is prepared to do that. And some may see that as a negative thing. I don't. She hasn't lost her moral compass in that, but she is able to see how perhaps bending the rules a little bit will ultimately get her to her goal, which is always a moral goal, and always a goal of to bring justice. But she doesn't mind bending the rules quite as much as she used to. She's trained in jiu-jitsu now, whereas after one too many kidnappings, she and Delilah tend to get kidnapped, and after one too many of those, she and Delilah have gone for jiu-jitsu lessons, and she's now able to defend herself and protect herself. So she's certainly not a atomic blonde. She's not there, but she's a woman who's grown and knows her strength, knows, I think more important than that, knows her worth and her value. And I like to have seen that development. She's now approaching, she started off at 22 years old, quite a young 22-year-old as well. And she's now, and I'm actually writing book 6 at the moment, and she's 27 in book 6, and feeling quite mature actually to write her, and I'm enjoying it. And in book 6 as well, she has a lot of anxieties, youthful anxieties, that she lays to rest, but I can't give away too much.
No. And I know we should never push on. I always hate to do this, but because you have a book that is about to come out, and of course, but you're busy with the next book.
I'm sorry for rabbiting on.
No, it's wonderful. This is what this is all about, so people get a chance to hear an author talk about what matters to them. It's really important. But I wonder if you could tell us if Poppy goes somewhere else in book 6.
In book 6, where are we up to? Oh, she's going to Oxford in book 6. I can tell you that.
You can.
Oxford, a female scientist is murdered.
Mm.
in Oxford, and she goes to investigate that. And in January, before the lockdown, I went down there, and again I went into the basement of the Science Museum, which used to be house laboratories, and I went down there and I walked around. That's where the murder is going to take place. So I explored. I called my emotional research, and I did my emotional research down there in January. Absolutely freezing, I can tell you that. It was the coldest January I've ever experienced, I think. Well, not quite, but it was near that. It was absolutely freezing. And I walked where Poppy would walk, and where the victim in this particular murder, where she lived and where she worked. And I'm hoping, global pandemics allowing, to go back down in August again, because the story's developed a little bit, and I want to also, it'll be nice because it's warmer. I'll be able to go down there again, have a little walk around, and do a bit more emotional research down there. And also sitting in the White Horse Tavern where Poppy is going to be having a lunch. And yeah, I don't quite go in dressed up like this. This is my Lady Cora look from Downton Abbey.
Which is, you know, Fiona, I am so glad that I'm aware of the time, and I'm going to have to draw our discussion here to a close, which saddens me tremendously. But I really appreciate the fact that you have dressed accordingly, because it, you know, it puts us in the mood, and it takes us there. And I still think, you know, we need to be transported at the minute, because there's so much uncertainty, you know, and we're all struggling with various different bits, I think, of life as we come out of lockdown or not. And I think to be able to be in a place of the imagination is beautiful. I want to wish you all the very best with the art fiasco in October. I know people are going to really enjoy it. It was a thrill to have a sneak preview. So thank you and your publishers for that. I'm much appreciated. And I hope that you and I can meet in real life soon. Yeah. But until then, all the very best.
Coffee on me next time.
Bless you. Thank you for that. We'll see you soon. Yeah.
And you. Cheers.
Cheers.